Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and hello again to those of you who attended our first session of our RPA series. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're glad you could participate today. My name is Yaslan Arroyo, and I'm the marketing coordinator at Auxis, and we're a management consulting and outsourcing firm based in South Florida, and we focus on helping organizations achieve peak performance in their back office operations. Today we're presenting part 2 of our RPA webinar series, Diving into RPA, and it's going to be presented by Eric Liebross. Eric is our Senior VP, and he leads our back office optimization practice, and his areas of expertise include shared services strategy, nearshore outsourcing, and RPA. Before we go ahead and get started, if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. I also want to let everyone know that we'll be sharing a copy of today's presentation slides along with a link to the webinar recording. So now I'll turn it over to Eric.
Thank you, Yaslan, and welcome everyone to today's webinar. As Yaslan mentioned, this is actually the second in a series of webinars that we've provided. The overall series is called RPA, Your Guide to Getting It Right. The first webinar was entitled RPA 101, and what we basically did in that webinar was provide an overview of the overall concept of what RPA is and how it interacts with your operations and your business community. We also talked about some various other considerations, such as why you should even look at doing RPA, and we gave some examples of some of how companies are using it in today's back office operations, as well as some of the benefits that you can expect to achieve from working with RPA. And then lastly, we gave some key considerations into the way you should look to implement RPA and provided a concept of an implementation roadmap for your RPA journey that you would be beginning to take. So in today's webinar, we're going to focus a lot more in detail on the actual ways to identify, evaluate, and prioritize the RPA opportunities in your organization. We're going to go into a lot of detail about the methodology that we employ to help identify those opportunities, quantify those opportunities, and provide a lot more structure into the RPA assessment that you would want to do. In addition, we're going to talk about the types of skills and capabilities that will be needed into your organization if you elect to implement and then use RPA and then support it ongoing within your organization. We're going to spend some time talking about some of the major software vendors that are out there in the market and some of the comparisons between them. And then we will also talk about the various deployment models that are available with RPA, whether you're looking to do it internally or with a partner, and whether you're looking to do it in kind of a service, RPA as a service type of model. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time talking about your workforce. And one of the challenges that companies face is the impact to the workforce in implementing a solution like RPA. So how do you embrace your workforce? How do you communicate with them? And what can you expect out of that type of communication? So with that, I'll get started on going into the details of the webinar. So as I mentioned, I want to spend some time working on the overall RPA opportunity assessment approach and kind of the steps that we take as an organization to evaluate and prioritize the various RPA opportunities. It really starts with the overall roadmap. So an RPA roadmap is not just about the assessment, but it follows various steps that we highly recommend. So after the initial assessment, where you're identifying the various RPA opportunities, we typically recommend a proof of concept to start the process, and then ongoing implementation once you've completed the proof of concept to bring in other processes that can be automated. And then lastly, to set up a structure of a formalized operations and management of the RPA environment with multiple checkpoints throughout this process. You should be kind of stopping and taking a step back and saying, let me look at the plan and how it fits into the organization, and then let me look at the performance to see if we've gained what we expected, understand the benefits, and categorize some lessons learned so that you can apply those into future implementations. but one of the keys is that when RPA is implemented, it should also be institutionalized. And what I mean by that is you should look to restructure your operations and formalize a support, monitoring, and management environment to ensure business continuity and stable performance. And we'll spend some more time talking about all of that later in the webinar. The overall RPA assessment that we typically recommend can take on several different flavors. So there are three options that I'll discuss right now. The first one is what we call a strategic assessment. So this is typically a larger, more comprehensive, broader look at your organization and how RPA fits into it. So it starts with a look across the entire organization to determine where the key opportunities are for RPA and where you should focus your time. It also establishes the strategy of how RPA fits into your organization. Is it a tool that's going to support business growth? Is it really just about cost savings and cost reduction? Are you trying to become more scalable, flexible? Are you trying to realign your organization? These are all the things that we help you get your arms around and establish a strategy of RPA going forward. And then from that, we provide a long-term RPA roadmap, which includes not only the processes that you would want to implement, but which are the correct tools, making essentially a vendor selection process, as well as how you want to deploy it and a business case. So this type of assessment takes a little bit longer. Typically, we see it taking about 8 to 12 weeks, and it has a higher upfront cost and a longer time to value, but it provides a lot more information than some of the other assessments we'll talk about. The opportunity assessment is a more narrow version of the strategic assessment. So what this is basically saying is you've already made the decision that RPA fits into your organization and you know kind of where you want it to fit. So now we're starting to look at functions. So we may take a look across an entire department, say finance and accounting, and determine where the best opportunities are. And we categorize, quantify, and prioritize those opportunities based on the various parameters of the assessment, which we'll discuss in a little bit. We also create a short and a longer term RPA roadmap and provide some details around how the deployment model should work. And then what you're really doing is looking at kind of the next steps in that process. So there's a POC and all the other steps beyond that once the POC is implemented, proof of concept, sorry. So this has a lower investment, has a relatively fast time to value. It's only about a 4 to 6 week engagement, and provides you with very good information, but again very focused in a particular area or department, and not really taking on a strategic perspective. The third option that we offer is what we call a proof of concept assessment. Now this is a very, very focused, very narrowly viewed assessment. It's where an organization has made the decision to implement RPA and even has an idea of where they want it to go, but they really want to understand, is this the right place to start? So it has typically a predefined scope where you go in and we look at the specific process area, the specific activities that are being done, and how RPA would impact those opportunities and what the benefits are. So we would basically identify what these savings are, and it ultimately becomes, in essence, a yes or no decision. You're basically looking at this and saying, this is the right place to start, or maybe we should look elsewhere. So it's a small time frame to complete, 2 to 3 weeks, small upfront investment, has a quick road to value, but you're really just focusing on one particular area. In terms of the assessment steps that we take, let's spend some time talking about what some of those details are around that, because it's important to understand what's involved in doing an assessment, whether it's our approach or whether you're doing this internally or even with another partner. These are the key steps you want to be looking for. So it starts with the process analysis itself, and what you're doing there is that you're going to start by looking at the various processes and functions that you're considering for RPA, but then you're taking those processes and functions and breaking them down into the various processes, sub-processes, and activities within the functions. The reason you do this is because RPA needs to understand every step in a process, because you need to understand where the robot can have an effect on that process. So by categorizing and detailing all of the activities in a process, you really get a full holistic view of the process itself and how RPA can benefit it. You get to this by doing a process walkthrough where you're doing either workshops or interviews with key subject matter experts in the organization for the functions that you're evaluating. So you'd sit down with, maybe the operational management as well as some of the key experts in the area to explain how a process works and break it down for you into the various steps. The other thing that you're doing as part of this step is compiling the data within the process area itself. So this is a bunch of different things that you're looking at, starting with the volumetrics, how many transactions are flowing through the process area based on what kind of timing. You're also looking at cycle time. So you're literally capturing the time it takes to complete a transaction based on all the steps that you've previously identified. How long does it take to complete those steps? From that information, the volumetrics and the cycle times, you develop a productivity and performance analysis and ultimately an FTE analysis where you're essentially saying this is the amount of time it should take to complete a transaction. This is the amount of transactions I have in the organization. Therefore, this is the amount of staff I typically would need to employ, and let's compare that to my current structure. That information then drives a cost analysis. So now you're looking at the overall payroll cost and any other costs that are associated with the work being performed. So it might be facilities, it might be software licenses, it might be infrastructure. You want to categorize and capture all of the different costs that are applied to a specific function. So we would go in and pull that information together, ultimately to create a per transaction cost. So you can now say that the transaction that is flowing through your business would cost X amount of dollars to complete. We then do a benchmarking analysis if the information is available to compare your current state to industry benchmarks. And that's going to give you a good insight into whether or not there's an opportunity. Because if you're top performer at the highest end of an operation, it's probably less likely you're going to have a significant impact from an RPA operation. But what we typically find is even the benchmark data doesn't necessarily account for RPA because it's still a relatively new innovation into the back office operations. So therefore what you're seeing is RPA is going to take that best performer and add another level to it. The other thing that you're looking for in this part of the exercise is what we call the systems complexity analysis. And what that really means is within an RPA implementation process, the RPA platform needs to interact with your current systems infrastructure. And in some cases, the systems infrastructure is going to be more compatible to an RPA solution than in others. So you're looking for the core systems that are being used, how many systems are being used, are there integrations where data is passing through, or do you need to manually compile that data, the underlying hardware and software that resides, and the stability of all of these things. The complexity is very important because it allows you to determine not only how effective RPA will be, but also how complex it will be to develop a robot to support that type of transaction. And I'll spend some more time talking about some of this stuff in a little bit. All that information that we've previously compiled gets rolled into an RPA opportunity assessment where we're measuring the potential of a process, the complexity of the process, what type of performance improvements you can expect to get, and the cost savings. This is really driven by the RPA cycle times. So now we're looking at how long would it take the process to work with a robot instead of a human worker, and where the robot would impact it. Ultimately, this all gets driven into a business case where you're comparing your current total cost versus the RPA operating cost, the end state with RPA, and factoring in all of the levels of investment that you need to apply for RPA and what type of cost savings you would get. So that business case is usually one of the key criteria to determining if RPA makes sense for this function or not. Lastly, once you've evaluated a series of processes, you basically take and compare all of those different processes to eventually come up with a recommendation for the initial proof of concept. So proof of concept, by my definition, is the first function that we're going to implement RPA within and test it out, and its full cycle. So it's all steps of a process. and to see what the benefits are. Did we get the benefits that we were expecting? Did it take us the time and cost that we were expecting to implement? Are we achieving the projected cost savings? This is a key step because you're going to get a lot of information out of this and the lessons learned, both to determine if RPA is the right fit and also how do you determine what the next implementation should look like based on some of these lessons learned. So the other part of the assessment recommendation is that roadmap. We recommend, based on the various processes we've assessed, how to prioritize these various processes and what the sequencing should look like. So let's spend some time now talking about how we really dig into a process to determine whether or not it's a good candidate for robotics process automation. And it really starts with the overall process characteristics that are embedded within a process itself. So these characteristics will really determine how effective RPA can be applied. This really helps you identify the RPA potential. So we've identified 8 factors that we typically look for within a process to determine if it's a strong candidate for RPA. So it starts with the volume of transactions and the number of people assigned. So high volume, a lot of transactions flowing through the business. That's usually a good place to automate something, as well as if you have a lot of people required to perform the task, that could help to drive the cost savings. Is the process highly manual, and are there a lot of repetitive activities? So what that's telling you is it's not a complex process, and then with the next step, are there clear defined business rules to drive those manual and repetitive activities? If so, it's a good candidate for RPA. The amount of judgment, the amount of exceptions that take place is typically where RPA loses some of its potential, because you still need human workers to get involved in various steps in the process. Another thing you're looking for is the stability of the process. If you have a process that has a large number of exceptions, or there's all kinds of data coming at you in different forms and it requires a lot of interpretation, or the systems themselves are not very stable and basically have a lot of hiccups in the process, that's telling you it's probably not a good candidate for RPA. If the process requires access to multiple systems, that's generally a good candidate for RPA, because the time and effort it takes to go in and out of systems to capture data and to move data from place to place is something a robot can do very quickly as compared to a human worker. Another key consideration is the availability of structured and digital data. So if you have structured and digital data available, it's a very strong candidate for RPA. So structured and digital data might mean it's coming in through a web form, or it's coming out of an existing system, and it's something you can take and drop into Excel, for example. So that's a good definition of structured and digital data. But in many cases, non-structured data can be converted into digital data through a process like OCR, optical character recognition, and that can then be able to be applied into an RPA process. So what happens there is you're also looking at the various inputs and forms and sources of data to determine how standardized are these. So if you have a fairly standard form, even if it's handwritten or comes in from multiple sources, that standard form is relatively easy to digitize and then turn into structured data. If it's a very non-standard form and everybody that presents the information presents it differently, it becomes a lot harder. So that's a consideration that you want to look at. We've already talked about the compatible and stable systems infrastructure. That's an important consideration, and the more incompatible and more unstable your systems, the less likelihood that RPA would work effectively. And then the last point we look at is the business case. You're going to make an investment here. There's going to be drivers in it. One of them should be a financial driver, and that business case should be one of the factors you're considering. So a strong business case helps to determine the potential candidacy of a process for RPA. So in this simple example here, what we're showing is if you're looking at 2 processes, accounts payable invoice processing and accounts receivable order processing, what you have there is you have 2 that are relatively similar, but based on the little circles we have here, AP is the best RPA candidate. That's a very simplistic view. We provide a lot more analysis to get to this point, but we wanted to give you a sense of what we're looking for. And here's an example of what we're looking for. This is part of a form that we use. It's an assessment worksheet that we use to evaluate the potential candidacy and benefits and outputs of an RPA environment. So I'm not going to go through all of this, and this will make your head spin, but I'm going to break down some of the details of this so you understand what we're looking for. Just wanted to give you a sense of the kind of level of effort that's involved here. So it starts with the process activity and systems breakdown. And what you're really doing is you're taking a process, in this case we're looking at an example that's accounts payable, and breaking it down into its key sub-processes or activities. So here we're talking about invoice indexing, invoice entry, invoice coding, etc. All the different steps that are involved in the accounts payable process. Now you may even want to take this a step further and look at a section of accounts payable. So maybe you just want to look at the invoice processing part of it and exclude things like, the exception handling and payment entry and vendor support and stuff like that. So what you're doing here is, this is a high-level view, but you may want to break it down into its various key sub-processes and activities, because you need to look at every step in the process, as we mentioned earlier. This allows you to evaluate the automation potential based on these predefined characteristics that we've talked about previously. And, in the example here that I'm citing, it's showing an automation potential of 72%. So 72% is usually a very good candidate for potential for automation, because you have a lot of factors that are saying it will work and work well. Now, automation complexity, the lower the number here, the better off you are. So in this case, what this is telling you is automation complexity in this case is relatively high. My guess is it would be because there's a lot of unstructured data that still will require a lot of human interaction and human intervention, and there's probably disconnected systems that you have to go in and out of, adding more complexity to the process. You want to look at all of the various data sources, the number of systems, the number of screens, the number of fields, all of the different steps that are involved in the process to understand what the robot would need to do to perform the process. So this gives you a kind of the insight into the potential and the complexity. But let's spend a little more time talking about that. In terms of potential, you're basically looking at those key characteristics that we talked about, the volume, the repetitive, the business rules, the exceptions, etc. But not all processes are necessarily going to be good candidates for automation beyond just their operational characteristics. There are other factors that you want to take into account. So you want to evaluate a process not just for these characteristics, but also the stability, which we've already talked about, but let's also talk about another key factor, which is cultural and organizational inhibitors. What do I mean by that? Well, I have an example of a client I'm recently working with where they have a process that screams out for automation. It's very manual. It has a lot of structured and digital data. It has a lot of things that make it a good candidate for automation, and they have a lot of people doing it. So there's going to be a good business case. The challenge is that culturally they want to be very focused on interacting with, in this case, their sales organization to support them and to quickly resolve issues so that ultimately customer service benefits. So I would probably argue that you can automate a lot of that and not lose your customer service benefit, because you're going to get speed as a result and you're going to get accuracy as a result. However, you're not going to get the personalization. And so in this case, the client is very concerned about losing that personal touch, and there's what I would call cultural and organizational inhibitors. So that becomes ultimately a business decision you need to make, and it goes beyond the basic characteristics. So when you evaluate a process, you need to consider that for part of its potential in fitting into an RPA environment. The other thing is you're looking for are processes that are non-standard or unstable. If that's the case, what I recommend is taking a process and first cleaning it up, making it more stable, making it more streamlined, standardizing the process, and allowing yourself the ability to automate a better process rather than a broken process. That's often the case that people try to do, is they try to fix a process that doesn't work and automate it. And you'll get some benefit, but it's still going to probably require more human interaction than you'd want. So you have to consider all of this and put this all into perspective. So at the end of the day, automation potential isn't just about those key characteristics, but it's also about process improvements, organizational and cultural impacts, and whether or not the systems environment supports this type of operation. And another factor that goes with systems is, are you planning to make a change? So if a process is impacted by a system and there's a planned system upgrade or change to a new system, you'd probably want to wait until the system is in place before you would go forward on the RPA implementation, because essentially you're going to have to redo it. Now let's take a look at complexity, which is a different set of factors that you're looking for. So really, complexity in this case is determined by a combination of things. It's a combination of the process itself and the intricacies of that process, and also the expertise required to program those intricacies, as well as the underlying systems and infrastructure that supports it. So complexity goes beyond the initial development and factors in the ongoing support that's needed to maintain the robotic code. So you have to look at how complex is it going to be to develop it, how complex is it going to be to maintain it and support it ongoing, and whether or not the environment is stable and essentially fits into an RPA operation, or whether or not the environment needs a lot more development to make it work. So we come up with 3 measures of complexity. So there's low, medium, and high. So low complexity is basically things that are pretty standardized already, that have structured and digital data, could be a desktop application or a web application, and the development that's needed to complete it is going to be relatively simple with minimal levels of customization. The other thing that a lot of these RPA platforms offer is what we call process recording. So for those of you who worked with Excel macros and you've kind of created a macro where you're kind of clicking and copying the steps that you take, you could do the same thing with an RPA environment for simple processes. So it doesn't require high degrees of expertise in the coding of the process. So there are applications like that are low complexity that fit in well. Now, medium complexity is something that's where you're starting to take on some of the other aspects of a process that aren't as easy to automate. Things like you're moving data between systems. Virtualized infrastructure often presents a challenge because virtualized infrastructure, things like Citrix, create a different set of programming requirements than if you're working natively with an application. The programming is more complex. The stability of that process is a little bit more challenging, so it's a more complex programming environment. And then once you introduce something like optical character recognition, OCR, you're adding a layer of complexity as you convert standard non-digital data and you have to interpret that data, more complexity comes in. So a high complexity process is where you take that to the next level. Now you're talking about very difficult to interpret OCR type data, whether or whether there's a lot of inputs and complex security requirements to kind of get through, or whether there's a lot of exception handling and you need to define some business rules within the robot itself that says within these certain thresholds, complete the process or push it out to a human for further processing. Those things, those kind of if and variable type of things, create a higher degree of complexity, and you have to account for that. So when you're evaluating a process, yes, you look at the potential, but you also have to factor in the complexity, because what that ultimately means is it's going to take longer to implement, and it's also going to require a higher degree of skill to implement and support ongoing. So now let's take a look at some of the details of the evaluation that we're performing beyond just the process steps itself. So in this case, what we're looking at is a volumetric analysis. So what we're doing here is we're compiling the basic volumetrics of a process. So in this case, again, accounts payable, you're seeing some of the key, for those of you who are working in AP, you'll recognize a lot of these kind of factors, the number of invoices, the number of line items, the number of exceptions, the number of errors that are occurring, etc. All these are broken down because they apply to the robotic process that you're going to ultimately capture. This is going to allow you to do some of that baseline benchmarking and determine if there are opportunity areas even outside of robotics, but it's a key driver for the ultimate end state of what robotics will look like. The next thing that you do is the cycle time capture. So now what you're doing is you're taking the steps that you've previously identified and broken down, and you're literally timing the steps to complete it. So how long does it take to enter an invoice? How long does it take to process an invoice, to code an invoice, to perform the three-way match, to handle exceptions, to handle vendors' inquiries, etc. You literally are capturing all that time, because what happens is the time that it takes to complete the process and the volumetrics that you saw on the previous screen ultimately give you the total cycle time that you see here for a process to be complete. So the total cycle time, how long for each step in the process, gets ultimately added up to become the total amount of hours that are available, and this will allow you to determine how many FTEs that you would need. Now what you see here is we're not using 100% productivity level for our FTEs, because the reality is, whether people want to admit this or not, a human worker who works 8 hours a day isn't really productive for 8 hours a day. So there's lunch, there's breaks, there's meetings, there are things that they have to do that are not necessarily related to the processing of a transaction. So what we typically do is use 80% of the available hours for an FTE to come up with the productive, or let's call them transactionally productive hours for an FTE. So once you've done that calculation, you now say take all of these hours, divided by all of this amount of hours available, and this is how many FTEs would be required to complete that process. Now what I'm showing you here is that the FTEs that are assigned to the process are 9, and the FTEs that would be required based on performance are 7.5. So that's already telling you that there's going to be an opportunity to reduce the number of FTEs and you probably run leaner, but you know that within your organization itself, just straight baselining it, you're going to have probably a 20% improvement opportunity available to you. The next step in the process is to do a detailed cost analysis. So what you're now doing in this process is essentially you're calculating the fully loaded cost of an FTE. So that is their salary plus taxes and benefit load. You know, you can actually use the real numbers, or you can use a percentage. We often use about 20% to capture that. And then you also want to add to that any other costs that are associated with the person's use of and ability to perform the transactions. So it's the actual cost of the facilities and allocating some of that cost to the person, the underlying infrastructure, the software, the licenses for the systems to complete this type of process. So once you put all this information together, you calculate it by the number of FTEs. As you recall, it was 9, and this is telling you that the cost to run the accounts payable process in this example would be about $666,000 a year. You then take that and translate it into a cost per transaction and a cost per line item. And the reason you do that is because these are good benchmark data that you can compare to. There's a lot of good benchmark information out. AP would be a great example where you could see where your cost is versus the cost for peers in your industry versus what the ultimate robotic cost would look like. So a lot of times you'll have this information available. Sometimes you won't. I will tell you and caution that benchmark data has only a limited value, because you really have to make sure you're comparing apples to apples, and often you're not. So use it as a guideline, but not as kind of the ultimate criteria for where you think you should be. So once we've captured all that information, now you take a look at the same process from an RPA perspective. So what we're doing is, in this example, this is very similar to the cycle time screen that you saw before, but now what's changing is that there are certain activities where you're now saying the impact of a robot versus the actual person performing the job. So as you may recall, invoice entry was 3 minutes, invoice processing was 8 minutes. As you can see here, we're basically saying 15 seconds for the robot to complete this task. So this is where you truly see the impact of the robot in your environment and how well the robot will improve the efficiency of that environment. You also are going to note that there are going to be certain activities, here's a good example, vendor support, that isn't going to be improved upon because you're typically not going to have the robot necessarily involving with interacting with your vendors. So in that case, you're basically saying that effort doesn't change, it stays manual. So when you do your calculation in the end, what you're doing is you're now coming up with a number that shows you the true impact of the RPA environment, accounting for the things that still stay the same, the amount of effort involved in supporting a vendor versus the impact of a robot. So basically what we've talked about is by calculating the cycle time of our robotic process and what the impact of the robot will have on the various steps in the process, you're able to calculate what your efficiency gains would be. But you need to account for not just the steps in the process, but also things like system performance, data conversions, the number of systems to access. So for example, if you're going to go from step to step to step in a system, the speed of that, the robot can do it fairly quickly, but the time it takes to go from one system to another, the robot doesn't control. The robot doesn't give you the answers for that. That's really dependent upon the speed of your operating infrastructure. So hopefully that's not a big factor, but you do need to account for it. So that then drives the business case. So in the example that we were talking about previously, where we had an operating cost over $600,000, we're now showing you that based on the 2 FTEs plus the cost of the RPA environment, you'll be able to save about $473,000, a 76% cost savings. And this cost savings, the RPA operating cost, this already includes all of the various investments that are required, the licensing of the robot itself, the time and effort and cost to develop the robot, any training, ongoing support of the robot, and even other costs should be factored in. For example, if you are going to plan to release staff, include your severance in the calculation. You want to have a true ROI to determine what your benefit is. So ultimately, you come up with the factor. But generally, if you see a savings in that's above 30%, that's always a good consideration. And if you're above 50%, it's almost a no-brainer to consider RPA for this process. One of the quick ways to tell the benefit is to go back to that cost per transaction metric that I talked about previously. So we're here where you have a current cost of $11.66, which we indicated. Here's your benchmark cost, so you know from here to here, there's a big difference and a big opportunity. But here is the RPA operating cost. So you know that it's even going to bring you better than your median benchmark performer. It'll actually get you probably at the level of the best benchmark performer or even below that. So RPA, in this case, drives tremendous value. So now it's important to understand that once you've completed this assessment and you've gone through this process, there are quite a number of other steps that need to be employed to complete the implementation. So here's the first step where we've identified what the first opportunity is, what the opportunity is. But now, once you've identified that opportunity and you're beginning your proof of concept, you need to do a high-level process and organizational design to define how the RPA environment will operate. The people, the processes, the way you interact with the systems and the transactions, and who needs to touch it and when, all needs to be designed up front. Once you've done that, you then document the process in detail, recording every single step in the process, noting all the exceptions, noting where judgment is required and handoffs are required, because all that information gets turned over to a developer, and that developer will then have to go and code the operational instructions for the robot, which then needs to be thoroughly tested across all different kinds of scenarios to ensure that you're getting what you need out of it, ultimately going into what we call a soft go live. A soft go live in this case is basically you're likely going to run the robotic environment in monitored batches of transactions, so there's going to be some parallel processing, people doing it versus the robot doing it, not the same transactions necessarily, but segments of it. You may carve out some for the robot, some for the human workers. But ultimately, you should transition all of the processes that are in scope and all of the transactions that are in scope to the robot itself to get yourself into full production, at which point you have to look at a different type of organization. You need to redefine the roles in your organization, and the role of a processor changes, the role of the people supervising this changes because now you're incorporating the RPA into it, but you also need to have new roles in your organization, monitoring and administrating the robotic environment, and people who are just dedicated to, for example, handling exceptions or the remaining activities that are not automated. So that leads us to the point about building an RPA team. And the RPA team itself typically is going to be a combination of technical and operational staff. But it starts with executive management. It starts with the commitment to and the sponsoring of RPA, and then ultimately someone taking on the lead role of a champion RPA, because these two roles are critical. You're going to have resistance, you're going to have people without the vision or the flexibility to see how this works. There needs to be a commitment to it, and it needs to be somebody who's kind of evangelizing what RPA is. Once you've done that, you bring in the rest of the resources. It starts with a business analyst who's typically going to be a process subject matter expert who understands how operations works, and that person is the one doing the documentation. So this person is going to be in charge of creating all the detailed process maps and detailed information that the developer will use to code the robot. The RPA solutions architect is the one who's going to work at the beginning stages of this process, defining it, but the developer is the one that's then writing the code, and the infrastructure engineer is the one that's building out the robotic infrastructure itself. The RPA operator and service support, these are sort of new roles in your organization, but they kind of exist today. Why? Because they're probably going to come out of your current operational environment. So the role of an AP clerk, for example, is going to change. And that AP clerk will likely become a robotic operator. What do I mean by that? That's a person who's going to administer the transaction flow through the robot. It's going to monitor it. It's going to look at the transactions that are occurring and identify any exceptions that need to be addressed at a human worker. The robot will tell you there's an exception, but then somebody needs to deal with it. So this is the person that kind of administers all of that. And then the RPA service support structure is the next step in the process. And what that does is basically it's the first line of defense. When an issue occurs, is it a transactional issue that the operator could fix, or is it more of a systematic issue, whether it's the code is breaking in the underlying software, or whether there's something has changed in the robotic environment, or whether the infrastructure has an issue. If your network fails, let's face it, the robot's going to fail. So somebody needs to identify what this is and then take it to the appropriate resources, whether it's back to the technical resources to fix, or whether it's back to the operator to say this is an exception that you can address yourself. But what a lot of organizations do is they build this cross-functional team, often called a center of excellence or an RPA center of excellence, that basically pulls resources from both business and technology to essentially support this environment. So again, this is for an organization that has made a strong commitment to RPA being an integral part of your operation. You want to build a team that's going to support it from a process perspective, from an operational perspective, from a technical perspective, and from a support perspective. So this cross-functional team that you're seeing here, or the center of excellence that we've talked about, is where a lot of companies ultimately take RPA. Let's spend some time talking about the various vendors in the market, because that's something that people often question and ask about. And there's a lot of vendors out there. As you can see, this is a Forrester RPA quadrant that was produced earlier this year, and it's basically showing you some of the key players in the market. So not everybody's on here, but the ones that they consider the key players is on here. But what you can see from this is, yes, there are a lot of people, but there are really three leaders in the who are in the lead of this this solution. Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, and UiPath. So what I thought we would do is spend some time talking about those three leaders and give you some comparisons between them to get an understanding of, how one compares to the other, at a fairly high level. So from that same Forrester survey, they provided an evaluation based on a series of criteria for all the different vendors, but the top three scored the top three. So what you're looking at here is Automation Anywhere, Blue Prism, and UiPath. These are the ultimate scores of the three vendors that they've identified. And as you can see, each of them has certain strengths and weaknesses. So, for example, UiPath has considered very strong architecture, strong development, strong control room, which is the monitoring and management of the robotic environment, but is weaker on the business case and weaker on the install base. So essentially UiPath is kind of knocked down from some of the other two vendors only because of its lack of footprint in the market, whereas Automation Anywhere is fairly strong across the board and has a much bigger install base than either of the other two. Blue Prism is considered the second one in terms of install base, and also has a very strong rating as well. But this gives you a sense of some of the various features that are available, characteristics that are available. But at the end of the day, from my perspective, to be perfectly honest, I think they all kind of get you there. They get to the same result. They're providing the same type of outputs and efficiencies, and I haven't necessarily identified a significant functional or operational benefit one over the other. It's really a function of what makes the most sense for your organization and how you want to build it out. Which brings us to this kind of comparison. So where you're comparing Automation Anywhere to Blue Prism to UiPath, they all can kind of slice and dice this a little differently. So Automation Anywhere is essentially sold both through a channel, meaning resellers, and selling direct to customers. Most of their transactions support back office processing with about 10 in the front office, whereas Blue Prism, which is considered the pioneer in the space and has been around since 2001, does most of its business through a channel network for the resellers. And finally, UiPath, which is the newest kid on the block compared to these other two, having been hitting the market under this banner since 2015, just 2 years. I want to point out that UiPath has been around a lot longer than that, but it really wasn't labeled an RPA product until 2015. It did similar software-oriented type of activities, but it wasn't considered back-office oriented until they relabeled it in 2015. And again, mostly sold through partners. As you can see, there's a lot of different variables, but some of the key factors, I think, are ease of development. I think from my perspective and what we've seen here, Automation Anywhere is probably the most complex type of programming skills needed to implement something, mostly because it's purely script-based and really needs the ability to create code. It doesn't necessarily give you some tools that allow you to do a more visual process, although it does have the macro recorder available. So that is a first key step, whereas Blue Prism is considered an easier platform to work with, although they kind of require you to go through a very rigorous training process before you're going to be certified as a Blue Prism developer, and they do not provide the macro recorder. And then lastly, UiPath has a relatively simple and easy to use front-end designing process and does offer the availability of the recorder. I think the biggest difference between these platforms ultimately is going to be price. So if you look at it, the initial investment to get started with Automation Anywhere is going to be at least $100,000, and for that you get what you see here, some robots and some of the monitoring and development solutions that you need. You can add to that. There's an analytics platform that they typically recommend, so you're probably looking at closer to $150,000 to get started. Very similar cost structure with Blue Prism. They come at it a different way. They charge different things, but at the end of the day, the cost to get started is going to be in that range. Now, UIPath comes at it completely differently. They don't bundle things together. Everything is sold separately. So you're buying you can literally buy it one bot at a time, and an unattended bot versus an attended bot are two different types of things as well. And an attended bot is less than $2,000 a year, and you can literally build and develop a robotic environment using one attended bot and the developer studio. So your getting started point there could be less than $5,000. There's no minimum investment required. Now, in a similar vein, let's talk about partnering versus not partnering and how you want to get started. So RPA can be deployed in a lot of different ways. You may want to bring it into your organization. You may want to take it in and manage it internally, or you may want to work through a partner, or you may want to outsource it completely. The answer to this really depends on you and your organization and kind of the DNA that fits your organization. Some people want to bring everything in-house. Other people are much more comfortable and like to go through the process of having a partner help and not deal with the details of it. So in order to answer the questions for yourself, really, I think you need to ask a couple of key questions. First is, does RPA a strategic function or capability within your organization? And I think that's driven by what's the ultimate business objective. Are you looking for short-term savings? Is that the key goal of why you want to implement RPA? Well, I would kind of say that if that's the case, it's probably not considered strategic. It's really more of a cost-saving initiative. And if it is more about allowing you to grow your business and gain scalability and kind of restructure and refocus people's tasks, that's more of a strategic play. So it takes on a different impact in your business. The other key question to ask is, what's the capacity of your organization to manage this type of initiative? So remember, you've got to go through this process that we talked about to make it work effectively. And to do that process assessment, to map the processes, to develop it, to test it. These are skill sets that are unique to an RPA environment and not typically found in an organization. So you have to build them or buy them and bring them into your organization, and it's unlikely you can take people from your current organization and expect them to do both. So if your timing is quick and you want to get this thing done quickly, it's probably not a good thing to do to try to do it internally. You'd probably want to work with a partner and may eventually want to bring it in-house, but the starting point is really based on some of these factors. You know, at the end of the day, it's about whether you want to do it in-house, whether you want to go out in the cloud, whether you want to, what type of governance model you have, and whether you want to build that center of excellence. It all comes back to what's your DNA and where's the strategic fit. Some other considerations when you're talking about partnering is let's talking about some of the licensing factors that come into play. So for example, a lot of the vendors that we talk about, they license in very different ways. Some you can buy per robot, and the management and development tools are sold separately. Some per node, some per agent. Some bundle the management and development tools separately. Some include it. But typically, implementation will not be included with any of this. So a lot of the resellers often are not going to be the partner you work with for implementation. Now, direct with implementation is typically going to be with a reseller. In most cases, there will be, you could get some vendor support, but I don't see that typically very likely. So in this case, you're buying from a reseller and they're providing the implementation services. Whereas in an outsource model, it's really RPA as a service. You're doing it completely different. You're basically telling the third party to take on the process. So they're going to do the design, implementation, architecture, and support, and how they charge for that can vary. It could be a per transaction cost. It could be a per function or service cost. It could even be a percentage of the savings. You have to kind of work with your partner there to decide what makes the most sense for you. And the other thing that they can do is bundle the implementation and software costs along with the ongoing operational costs, or you can take that as a one-time expense and then look at the operational costs separately. A lot of different ways to slice this. You just need to decide what's key for you. Another key factor that I want to point out in terms of partnering is just the concept of proof of concept. So I've talked about how I define it, which is a fully functioning process that is handling all of the activities. Most vendors do not go down that route. What they will do is give you a vendor demo. And a vendor demo is a much more of a very quick and dirty, let's show you that it can work in your environment, maybe takes a slice of a process with limited transactional scope and limited exceptions or probably no exceptions, and it's usually done in a few days, and it proves that it can work, but it's not what I would define as a proof of concept. So be aware that when you're talking to a vendor and they talk about POC, they may not be using the same language that I'm talking about. You also want to consider long-term versus short-term reasons of why you want to work with a partner or not, whether you want to bring it in-house or not. But the key thing to understand is once this is implemented, there is no turning back. What you're going to be doing is taking your current staff and either moving them onto other tasks, or in some cases you may even release some people. If that's the case and that's what you're doing, you have to realize that if the robotic environment doesn't work, you can't just say, okay, you guys need to do this again. So you need to make sure that when you build the operation, whether it's in-house or with a partner, there's a strong support model that's available to deal with any issues that occur, because transactions have to go on. Lastly, and certainly not least, let's talk about the embracing of your workforce. So as you can see from these statistics, a lot of automation is expected to come over the next 5 to 10 years. There's going to be a lot of transaction processes occurring. And by the same token, there's a lot of fear and uncertainty in the marketplace, and a lot of people concerned about what does this mean to my workforce? And the workforce is saying, am I going to lose my jobs? And there's a lot of people fearing that automation will drive large amounts of unemployment in the United States or elsewhere. Well, let's consider some of the other disruptive technologies that have occurred over time. The printing press, the telegraph, the telephone, I can go on. But as you can see, all of these technologies came in and had a huge impact to business operations. They've all been adopted and adapted into business operations. They were all in their own way disruptive technologies, but well, they didn't disrupt people's lives. All of the massive unemployment that had been predicted with every innovation that's occurred has not happened. Why? Because people need to adapt and change, and let's talk a little bit about that. Change can be scary, but it can also be liberating. So RPA requires a new set of skills and capabilities, ideally to be performed by some of the same people that are doing the job today. But understand this, and I think people will acknowledge it. Most of the tasks that you're going to automate are probably things that the employees would love to give up anyway. So educating your employees on how RPA will allow them to focus their time on higher value activities will help them to get on board, will help them to look at this in a more positive light. What we've seen is that most organizations who have implemented RPA have focused on increasing the efficiency and effectiveness of their operations rather than eliminating jobs. But don't kid yourself, that will still be part of the package. Those who embrace change, those people who say, I'm open to the change, I'm open to doing things differently, they're probably going to receive the benefits. Some of these benefits could be higher pay, more interesting work, better morale and motivation as some of the pain in the neck aspects of a job go away, and organizations themselves can expect lower attrition because people are doing more interesting work, and oh, by the way, robots don't quit. But with every innovation, there are some people who will be left behind. Accept the fact that not everyone will embrace the change or is capable of performing higher value work. You may love the person who's doing the current job today, but do they fit into the model of where you want them to go down in the future? Don't expect everyone to make that change work. But by the same token, you can't afford to let your business fall behind. Your competitors are doing it. This is what's happening in the marketplace. It's something you need to account for, and how you engage your workforce, how you communicate this to your workforce, and being realistic about your workforce are all key factors in how successful this will be. So in summary, an effective RPA roadmap should include a thorough analysis of the opportunities that are available, followed by the initial POC with a lot of checkpoints to evaluate, have you gotten what you expected? There needs to be a formal methodology to quantify, identify, quantify, and prioritize the volumetrics of the RPA opportunities, and various key drivers include cycle times, volumetrics, and some of the complexities. The RPA operating model requires a trained and focused organization that knows how to work with an RPA operating environment. There are a lot of software vendors on the market offering a wide range of solutions at various price points. At the end of the day, what fits best for you is the one that you need to kind of make the decision on. It's hard. I think, in my opinion, they all get you to the same place. RPA there's a lot of different operating models. You could do it internally, you could do it outsourced, you can work with a partner, you can bring it in eventually. You need to decide what makes the most sense for you. And then lastly, you're going to be having a more effective environment with RPA, and you can take your best, most valued employees and give them better jobs, give them a higher level of ability to perform and provide a higher level of service to your customers. But not everyone will embrace the change. And that concludes the content of the webinar. So I thank everybody for participating. I'll now turn it back to Yaslin to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Eric. So before we open it up for questions, I just want to let everyone know that for joining us today, we're offering a complimentary 1-hour RPA consultation with Eric and his team to help with jumpstarting your RPA journey. And if you sign up, you'll be eligible to receive a free training by UIPath, which is a $600 value. If you're interested, just send an email to our marketing manager, Fabiana Corredor. Her email is there on the screen if you want to take a moment. And then if you would like to speak to Eric personally about today's topic or learn more about our services, you can email Eric directly, and his contact info is up on the screen. So now I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Let's see here. Do you find that the RPA team is led by the business or led by IT?
As I mentioned earlier, the best model that I've seen companies initiate is the combination of both. I don't think, like any business solution, IT can be the sole owner of a process. I think business needs to have significant input to it, and in a lot of cases needs to own the output because the transactions are still going to reside in their area. So the best model incorporates both. If you have to pick one, I'd probably pick it as a business solution, not an IT solution, because IT is really the implementer, but they're not the day-to-day operator. But my preference, my recommendation is to have this joint center of excellence type of process and have it be a joint solution.
Thanks, Eric. Can you talk more about where is RPA evolving to machine learning and AI? Which providers are leading this?
Well, that's actually another webinar because it's a very difficult question to answer. If you talk to the vendors, they all say that they're going down the IA path, but IA is really an emerging technology. And what do I mean by that? It's really starting to be seen out there. Yeah, it's been out there for a while, and things like, the most well-known one is IBM's Watson, and there's other companies. Another one that comes to mind is a company like WorkFusion that promotes heavily on IA. But Blue Prism and UiPath and Automation Anywhere and virtually all these other vendors will say that they provide IA solutions. My personal experience is that they're limited in capability, limited in what they're able to do, and the true IA solutions, like an IBM Watson, are very, very expensive. So at the end of the day, IA to me is not necessarily ready for prime time in terms of what companies are looking for. Yes, there are solutions that are robust, but the cost is often going to be prohibitive to the solution that you're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks, Eric. And there's another question here. What do you find is the biggest issue when it comes to adoption of the RPA by employees post-implementation of RPA?
Lack of flexibility or lack of willingness to change. So employees are going to be resistant. They're going to be fearful. Those are accepted pretty much. You have to accept those facts. So now at this point, what we have to do is we have to consistently reinforce the message to your employees that this change is happening and that there's positives out of it. In other words, your role is going to change. You have to learn and take on different skills. A lot of the transactional lower value work that you were doing before is no longer going to be needed. Your job now is to take on the higher value aspects of it. So the people who accept that message are the ones who will will enjoy the benefits of it. The people who resist, it's very hard to overcome that. And some people are just very set in their ways, and they consider this stuff science fiction and don't believe it's going to really work, even in the face of the fact that it is working. So you have to really continuously promote the message of change and flexibility and positivity around RPA, and hope that people adapt to that.
Thank you, Eric. Just looking through here, more questions. What does hold on. Do you have assessment and processes as is and to be flows documents that can be shared for some functions for RPA solutions?
Every process is unique. Every process has its own nuances, and what we're doing, first of all, is proprietary to each client that we've implemented the solution with, so we really can't share that process. But I don't know how applicable it would be to your environment anyway, because what you're doing here is you need to break that process down step by step by step, system to screen to field. Everything that you have to do, all the data inputs, all the data outputs have to be captured, and I can guarantee you, you're going to look at two companies doing the exact same process, and it's going to vary significantly. So, business rules are different, exception handling is different, etc. So, really, there's no shortcut here. You need to go through the process of detailing it and documenting it for yourself, and not assuming that an RPA environment that works in one environment will apply well to yours. Sorry about that.
Thanks, Eric. There's a question. Which of the 3 software vendor leaders is Auxis using in its BPO center in Costa Rica, and why?
We ultimately selected UIPath. We evaluated the various solutions out there and went beyond even the top 3. And we ultimately selected UIPath for a couple of reasons. And I want to preface this by saying I believe all of them get you to the same place. I believe all of them, they come at it a little differently. The complexity of working with them is a little different. The vendors themselves are sometimes easier to work with, harder to work with. But at the end of the day, our DNA, UiPath made a better fit. Why? Because it really required us to kind of take it on and do the development ourselves, learn it, and take it on, because UiPath did not have a huge, robust support engine. So yes, you can get training from them, but a lot of the development is really on you. So what we did was we felt that was how we wanted to take this on and learn it. Frankly, it also was at a much lower cost structure to get started. So when we started RPA, we wanted to test it out and see if it worked. We were able to get started with a cost of maybe $5,000 without the training and just for licensing, whereas with these other vendors, the investment was much, much higher. So for us, it was a quick and easy decision in the end because of the openness of the solution, the need to take on the need to take on the role of RPA development ourselves, and just an easier cost financial investment to make that decision essentially without looking for a huge return on the first investment.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is it safe to say that an effective operational model should follow the guidelines of the Agile methodology, or should we keep the waterfall practices?
Big believer in going Agile for this. I think the way this process changes, and let me preface this, I'm not a developer, okay? I don't develop anything. I'm a talker. That's what I do. I'm a business guy. But I'm familiar enough with Agile, I'm familiar enough with the development methodology, and I'm familiar enough with how we've done it that I think Agile is much more effective. Having those daily stand-ups and the constant interaction between the development team, the business team, I think is critical when you're implementing RPA solutions. So in my mind, and I would prefer to defer this question to my technical team, who's unfortunately not here. But if they were, I think they would share my sentiment that Agile is our preferred method of operation. Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. So I've put in the chat
my contact information and Eric's as well. If we didn't get to your questions, I apologize. You could feel free to email us. So I want to thank everyone. We appreciate you being here. We hope you found the information Eric shared with you today informative and valuable. And once you leave today's webinar, we would appreciate if you could take our brief survey on the presentation, so provide your feedback. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.